Of course, here is the intro in first-person English, around 150 words, with a strong hook and dramatic tone. I knew my marriage was over the moment I saw her in my seat. At my mother-in-law's 67th birthday party, under the crystal chandeliers and fake laughter, she had placed my husband's lover in the seat of honor right beside her, right where I was supposed to be. My husband didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. He looked guilty, and somehow, that was worse. The whole room went quiet when I walked in. Glasses froze midair. Conversations died. My mother-in-law smiled like she had been waiting for this exact moment and said, "Penelope, don't make a scene. There's another seat in the back. Another seat." At a party I had quietly paid for. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't ask a single question. I just stood there, stared at the woman sitting in my place, looked at my husband one last time, then turned around and walked out. That night he called me 97 times. I declined everyone. Then I blocked him. My name is Penelope Parker, and until that night I had spent 3 years confusing patience with love. The party was being held at the Grand Bellevue Hotel in downtown Chicago, in one of those glittering ballrooms people rented when they wanted to look elegant in photos and cruel in private. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. A string quartet played near the stage. Waiters floated through the room with champagne and polished smiles. Everything looked perfect. That was Diane's favorite kind of setting. My mother-in-law, Diane Parker, loved beautiful rooms because they distracted people from ugly behavior. At 67, she had mastered the art of public charm and private humiliation. To outsiders, she was graceful, witty, and generous. To me, she was a woman who treated kindness like weakness and marriage like ownership. I arrived 20 minutes late, still wearing the cream silk dress I had changed into in the office restroom after back-to-back meetings. In my hand was a velvet navy gift box. Inside was a sapphire brooch I had custom designed for Diane 6 months earlier. It had taken 3 jewelers, 4 sketches, and more money than I wanted to admit. Not because she deserved it. Because I was still trying. Still trying to be enough for a family that had already decided I never would be. The ballroom doors opened, and the room went quiet. That kind of silence is never accidental. It moves fast, like cold water. One table noticed me first, then another. Then the whole room seemed to pause at once. Forks hovered above plates. Wine glasses stopped halfway to lips. Even the musicians seemed to soften. I followed their eyes toward the center table, and there she was, Ashley Bennett. Blonde waves, white satin dress, soft smile, one manicured hand resting far too comfortably near my husband's arm. She was seated to Diane's left, in the seat everyone knew had been reserved for me. There was even a name card in front of her plate except mine had been removed. My stomach didn't drop. It hardened. My husband, Ryan Parker, looked up and froze. His face changed so quickly it would have been funny if it hadn't been my life. Surprise, fear, guilt, calculation, all in 2 seconds. Ashley gave me a tiny, polished smile, the kind women use when they want to seem innocent while standing on top of your dignity. "Oh," she said lightly, pressing a hand to her chest. "Penelope, I didn't realize." "No," I said. "I'm sure you didn't." Before she could respond, Diane lifted her champagne glass and smiled at me like this had all gone exactly according to plan. "There you are," she said. "You're late." I looked at the table. 12 seats. Every single one filled. No extra chair. No place set at the edge. Nothing. Just my husband's lover in the seat of honor and a room full of people pretending they didn't understand what they were looking at. I kept my voice even. "Why is she sitting in my place?" Ryan stood halfway. "Penelope, let's not." "Sit down, Ryan," Diane said sharply, not even taking her eyes off me. And he did. Just like that. Just like he always did when it came to her. Diane set down her glass and folded her hands as if she were hosting a charity luncheon instead of a public execution. "Ashley has been wonderful all evening. She came early, helped with the guest table, made sure everything was running smoothly. She has manners. She understands family." The last word landed like an insult. I glanced at Ashley. She lowered her eyes at exactly the right angle, just enough to look embarrassed, not enough to look guilty. "I really don't want any trouble," she said softly. "Mrs. Parker just told me to sit here." "Of course she did." I looked back at Ryan. "And you said nothing?" His jaw tightened. Can we talk about this later? I actually laughed then. Once. Quietly. Later. Men always want later when now might cost them something. Diane sighed dramatically, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Penelope, honestly, must everything become a performance with you? Ashley as a guest. You are making people uncomfortable. At my husband's mother's birthday? I asked. Where his mistress is sitting in my seat. Gasps fluttered around the room, followed by the frantic stillness of people who suddenly regretted staying for dinner. Ashley turned red. Ryan stepped forward. She is not. Don't lie to me in public, I said. You've already done enough in private. For the first time, Diane's expression sharpened. Watch your tone. I looked at her and felt something inside me go completely still. No, I said. You should watch yours. The room was so silent by then that I could hear the ice shift in someone's glass 3 tables away. Diane rose from her seat slowly, every movement dripping with offended authority. Let me make something very clear. This is my birthday, my event, my family. And if Ashley is more helpful, more respectful, and more present than you've been in years, then perhaps she deserves to sit where she is. There it was. Not even hidden anymore. Not cruelty disguised as thoughtlessness. Cruelty displayed proudly because she thought I would endure it. Because I always had. My fingers tightened around the velvet box in my hand. I thought about every holiday dinner where Diane corrected my cooking in front of guests. Every gathering where she introduced me as the career woman with that same thin smile. Every time Ryan told me, she doesn't mean it like that. Every time I accepted less to keep the peace. Ashley looked at me with that same carefully arranged sympathy. Penelope, if you want, I can move. No, Diane said, cutting her off. You stay right there. Then she looked at me and added, there's a seat in the back near the vendor table. I'm sure they can squeeze one in. The vendor table. Not even the family section. Not even the friends section. A folding chair in the back of a room I had quietly helped pay for. I stared at her for a long moment. Then I turned to Ryan. He looked miserable. Not angry, not ashamed, just cornered. And somehow that was worse. Do you agree with her? I asked him. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his mother, then at Ashley, then at me, and said nothing. That silence split something open in me. People think betrayal happens when someone lies or cheats or chooses another person over you. But sometimes betrayal is smaller and colder than that. Sometimes it's a man watching you be humiliated and deciding his own comfort matters more than your pain. I nodded once. Very slowly. I understand, I said. Diane seemed relieved. She thought I was surrendering. Ryan looked like he'd just been granted a pardon. Ashley straightened in my chair like she'd won something. I stepped toward the center table. Every eye followed me. Diane lifted her chin, expecting me to hand her the gift. I placed the velvet box gently on the tablecloth in front of her untouched dessert plate. Happy birthday, I said. For one brief second, greed flashed in her eyes before she covered it with offense. Then I looked at Ashley. Enjoy the seat, I said. It comes with more responsibility than you realize. Her smile faltered. Ryan moved toward me. Penelope, please, don't do this. I met his eyes, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't see my husband. I saw a weak man who had spent too long borrowing strength from women while giving none back. I'm not doing anything, I said quietly. I'm simply leaving you to what you chose. Then I turned around and walked out of the ballroom. No screaming, no crying, no shattered glass. Just the sharp sound of my heels against marble and the sudden understanding that I had been standing in the wrong life for far too long. Behind me, I heard Diane call out, if you walk out now, don't come back acting like the victim. I kept walking. Because at that point, I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the woman who had finally seen the whole picture. And once you see it clearly, you can never pretend again. When I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed. Ryan. I declined the call. By the time I stepped into the night air, he had called 3 more times. I declined those too. I slid into my car, locked the doors, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. My reflection in the dark windshield looked calm. Too calm. Like the version of me that survives something first and feels it later. The velvet gift box was no longer in my hand, but somehow, for the first time in a long time, I felt lighter. Then my phone started ringing again. Ryan. Again. And again. And again. I stared at his name, flashing across my screen, and whispered, no. Not this time. Then I started the engine and drove away. By the time I reached the parking garage exit, Ryan had already called 7 times. The 8th call came while I was waiting at a red light on Michigan Avenue. I let it ring. My phone buzzed again immediately after. And again. And again. Ryan had never called me like this before. In 3 years of marriage, he was the kind of man who believed problems solved themselves if you ignored them long enough. If we argued, he would disappear into work, or the gym, or a late dinner with clients. Silence was his favorite strategy. But tonight, silence belonged to me. The phone rang a 9th time. I declined it without hesitation. Chicago's skyline stretched across the windshield, glass towers glowing against the night sky. Traffic moved slowly, headlights reflecting on wet pavement from a light rain earlier that evening. Everything outside looked calm. Inside the car, however, my thoughts were razor sharp. Because the truth was, I had not been surprised tonight. Not completely. Ashley Bennett appearing in my seat had shocked me. But the betrayal itself? That part had been building quietly for months. The first sign had come 3 months earlier when Ryan forgot his jacket on the back of a dining chair. I was about to hang it in the closet when something fell out of the inside pocket, a printed receipt from a boutique hotel in Lake Geneva. A weekend stay, 2 guests, wine service, and a spa reservation for 2 people. The date printed on the receipt was the same weekend Ryan told me he was attending a mandatory tax strategy conference. When I asked him casually about the conference a few days later, he groaned dramatically and said, "Exhausting. 2 straight days of presentations." I remember smiling and saying, "That sounds awful." Then I changed the subject. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I did something Ryan never imagined I would do. I started paying attention. Over the following weeks, I noticed patterns. Small ones at first. A dinner charge to our shared card at a restaurant Ryan had never taken me to. A boutique purchase that definitely wasn't my style. A calendar entry that mysteriously vanished after I asked about it. Individually, they were easy to explain. Together, they formed a very clear picture. Then came the final confirmation. One evening, Ryan left his laptop open in the study while he took a call on the balcony. I wasn't snooping at first. I simply walked past the desk and noticed an email preview that included a familiar name, Ashley Bennett. The subject line read, "Lease agreement confirmation." I stopped walking. I wish I could say I turned away, but I didn't. I clicked. The document opened instantly. A furnished condo in River North. 12-month lease. Occupant, Ashley Bennett. Financial guarantor, Ryan Parker. I stared at the screen for a long time. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. What I felt instead was something colder. Clarity. Ryan stepped back into the study a few minutes later and saw me sitting at the desk. He froze. "Hey," he said carefully. "What are you doing in here?" I closed the laptop slowly and looked at him. "Your email was open," I said. His expression shifted in that familiar way, first surprise, then calculation. "It's work stuff," he said quickly. "Just helping someone with a lease." I held his gaze. "Someone named Ashley?" For half a second, he looked trapped. Then he laughed. "Penelope. She's a junior employee who needed a guarantor." "That's it," I nodded thoughtfully. "Of course." He relaxed immediately, assuming the explanation had worked. That was the moment I realized something important about my husband. Ryan didn't think I was stupid. He simply believed I would never challenge him. Because for 3 years, I hadn't. Not when Diane criticized my career in front of guests. Not when Ryan forgot our anniversary because of a client dinner. Not when family holidays somehow turned into subtle competitions where I was always the outsider. I had been patient, understanding, flexible, and Ryan had mistaken those qualities for permanent permission. But the moment I saw that lease agreement, something inside me shifted. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Instead, I quietly started preparing. I copied financial statements, saved screenshots, exported account histories. My attorney, Jordan Matthews, a calm, meticulous man who specialized in financial disputes, received a very polite email from me 2 weeks later asking for a confidential consultation. At the time, he asked only one question. "Are you trying to save the marriage or protect yourself?" I had answered honestly. "I'm trying to understand what's happening." Tonight, sitting in my car while Ryan called again and again, I finally understood. My phone buzzed again. Call number 14, then 15, then 16. I declined them all. When the 17th call came through, a text followed immediately after. Ryan. Penelope, please answer me. Another message arrived seconds later. Ryan. My mom didn't mean it like that. I let out a quiet laugh. Diane Parker had absolutely meant it like that. Humiliation had always been her preferred form of communication. Another message appeared. Ryan. We need to talk. I typed a reply, then erased it. Typed again. Erased again. Finally, I wrote one simple sentence. There is nothing left to discuss tonight. I hit send. For a few seconds, the phone stayed silent. Then it started ringing again. Ryan. I declined the call. This time, instead of driving home, I turned the car toward the lake. Lakeshore Drive was nearly empty at that hour, the dark water stretching endlessly beside the road. The city lights shimmered on the surface like scattered gold. I pulled into a quiet overlook and parked. Ryan called again. 19, 20, 21. I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat. For the first time since leaving the ballroom, I allowed myself to breathe. The humiliation of that moment replayed in my mind, the quiet room, Ashley sitting in my seat, Diane's satisfied smile. But another memory surfaced with it, a meeting from earlier that afternoon, the one no one at that birthday party knew about. At 2 o'clock that day, I had been sitting in the conference room of the Brooks Foundation, reviewing the final paperwork for a $2 million educational endowment. It was supposed to be Diane's birthday surprise. The announcement had been planned for the next morning at a family foundation brunch. Reporters would be there. Donors. University partners. The scholarship would carry Diane Parker's name. I had organized everything myself. 6 months of work, all because I believed honoring my late father-in-law's legacy might finally soften the tension between Diane and me. I looked at my phone again. It buzzed for the 23rd time. Ryan still thought tonight was about embarrassment. He still believed the worst part of the evening had already happened. What he didn't realize was that the real consequences hadn't even started yet, because the moment I left that ballroom, I made a decision. The scholarship announcement scheduled for tomorrow morning was not going to happen the way Diane expected. My phone lit up again. Call number 27, then 28. I picked it up. For a moment, I considered answering, just to hear what Ryan would say, just to hear the panic in his voice. But I already knew the truth. Ryan wasn't calling because he felt sorry. He was calling because he felt threatened. And that was an entirely different emotion. I declined the call again. Then I opened my contacts and tapped another name. Jordan Matthews. He answered on the second ring. Penelope? Everything all right? I looked out at the dark lake and said quietly, No, but it will be. There was a pause. Then he asked, What happened? My mother-in-law seated my husband's lover in my place at her birthday party. Another pause. Jordan sighed softly. That sounds intentional. It was. And Ryan? He stayed seated. Jordan didn't ask another question. Instead, he said the one thing that told me I had called the right person. All right, tell me everything. So I did. Every detail. Every piece of evidence. Every moment of tonight's humiliation. When I finished, Jordan spoke calmly. Penelope, there are 2 paths forward. What are they? You can pretend this never happened and go back to the life you had yesterday. I already knew I wouldn't choose that one. And the other option? I asked. Jordan's voice became firmer. The other option is that you protect your assets, your reputation, and your future starting tonight. I looked back at the skyline. Ryan's call count had reached 32. I picked up the phone, opened his contact, and blocked the number. Jordan, I said quietly. Yes? Let's start with option 2. I slept for exactly 3 hours that night. Not because I was crying, not because I was angry, but because my mind had shifted into something sharper than either of those emotions. Strategy. When you finally stop trying to save a relationship, you gain something dangerous for people who depend on your silence clarity. At 6:40 the next morning, sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the hotel suite Jordan had helped me book after our call. Chicago looked peaceful from the 32nd floor. Traffic moved slowly along the river. Early commuters carried coffee cups like tiny lifelines to their routines. Somewhere in the city, Ryan Parker was waking up to the consequences of the night before. I checked my phone. 97 missed calls. Not from Ryan, because I had blocked him. These were from unknown numbers. Ryan's office line, Ryan's assistant, Ryan's brother, and, unsurprisingly, Diane Parker. Her voicemail icon blinked 3 times. I pressed play. Her voice came through sharp and furious. Penelope, I don't know what childish stunt you think you're pulling, but you will call me back immediately. The foundation coordinator says the scholarship announcement materials disappeared overnight. We have reporters arriving at 11 o'clock. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? I deleted the message. The irony was almost funny. Diane believed the worst thing that had happened in the last 24 hours was embarrassment. She had no idea the real problem was control. Or more specifically, her loss of it. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. Unknown number. Penelope, it's Ryan. Please stop blocking me. We need to talk. Another message appeared seconds later. My mom is freaking out. Just call me. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing a reply. Penelope, contact my attorney. Then I blocked that number too. I placed the phone down and walked toward the small dining table where my laptop sat open. Overnight, Jordan had already sent 3 emails outlining the immediate legal steps we would take. The first was simple: file for legal separation. The second was more complicated: freeze access to shared financial accounts connected to charitable funds. The third was the one that would change everything: clarify donor authority before the foundation brunch. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. The brunch? Right. At 11 a.m., the Parker Family Foundation was hosting a legacy celebration at the Lakeshore Women's Museum. It had been Diane's idea, another elegant public event where she could receive praise for generosity she hadn't personally funded. The highlight of the morning was supposed to be the announcement of the $2 million scholarship endowment. My endowment. Diane had spent weeks telling friends how the family was expanding its charitable mission, but the truth was simpler. The money came from me, my company shares, my inheritance from my parents, my foundation's funds. I had structured the scholarship as a surprise gift in honor of my late father-in-law, Harold Parker, the only member of Ryan's family who had ever treated me with genuine warmth. Harold had once told me something that stayed with me long after his passing. Penelope, he said during a quiet afternoon in his study, a family name only means something if the people carrying it behave with dignity. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I understood he meant something much deeper. I opened the scholarship announcement document on my laptop. At the top, in elegant serif letters, it read, "The Diane Parker Legacy Scholarship." I stared at the words. Then I moved the cursor, deleted the name. For a moment, the line was blank. I thought about Harold, about the women the program was meant to help, about the humiliation in that ballroom. Then I typed a new title: The Eleanor Brooks Grant for Women Rebuilding Their Lives. Eleanor Brooks was my mother, a woman who raised me to believe that dignity was not negotiable. The change felt right, more honest, more aligned with the person I wanted to be after this marriage ended. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Ryan's voice exploded through the speaker. Penelope, thank God. I stayed silent. Why are you blocking me? He demanded. Do you have any idea what kind of situation you've created? Good morning, Ryan, I said calmly. He exhaled sharply. My mom says the scholarship announcement is gone. The foundation board is asking questions. What did you do? What I needed to do? Penelope, this is insane, he said. Last night was a misunderstanding. I actually laughed. A misunderstanding? I repeated. Mom went too far, okay? He said quickly. She shouldn't have seated Ashley there. I told her that. But you stayed seated. Ryan went quiet. That doesn't mean anything, he muttered. It meant everything. Ryan, I said softly, do you remember the condo lease you signed for Ashley? Another pause. Then he said the same line he used months earlier. It's not what you think. That's convenient, I replied. His voice hardened slightly. Look, whatever you think is happening, you don't need to destroy the foundation over it. That scholarship announcement is important to my family. No, I corrected. It was important to me. You're overreacting. There it was. The word men like Ryan always used when women stopped accepting disrespect. Overreacting. I glanced at the clock. 9:10 a.m. Ryan, I said. The brunch begins in less than 2 hours. I know. And reporters will be there. Yes. And donors. Yes, Penelope. Obviously. Then, I suggest you prepare for a different announcement. Silence. Then his voice dropped. What does that mean? It means, I said calmly, That I will be attending. Ryan sounded relieved. Good. Then we can fix this together. Oh, Ryan, I said quietly. We are not fixing anything together. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. You wouldn't, he finally said. You really think I'd embarrass my own family like that? I looked out the window at the city waking up below me. Ryan, I said. Last night your mother publicly replaced me with your mistress. That's not… And you said nothing. His breathing grew slower. Penelope. Yes? If you go through with whatever you're planning, he said carefully, there's no coming back from it. I closed my laptop. That's the point. Then I hung up. Outside, the morning sun reflected off the glass buildings across the river. Chicago looked bright, clean, new. In 2 hours, I would walk into that museum. Diane would expect gratitude. Ryan would expect reconciliation. The guests would expect a generous speech and polite applause. Instead, they were about to hear the truth. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in a person's life is not when they fight back. It's when they finally stop pretending everything is fine and start telling the story correctly. At 10:55 a.m., I stepped out of the car in front of the Lakeshore Women's Museum. The building stood beside Lake Michigan, a glass and stone structure designed to look modern, thoughtful, and quietly prestigious. It was the kind of place donors loved, elegant enough for photographs, meaningful enough to justify philanthropy. A banner near the entrance read, Parker Family Foundation Legacy Brunch. I studied the words for a moment. Legacy. The irony almost made me smile. Inside, the museum's atrium had been transformed into a polished event space. Round tables were covered in ivory linen. Tall white orchids rose from crystal vases. Soft piano music drifted through the room as guests mingled with coffee cups and polite laughter. About 100 people had already arrived. University administrators, local journalists, charity board members, and the Parker family's carefully curated circle of social allies. Everything looked perfectly orchestrated, exactly the way Diane liked it. The moment I walked through the doors, conversations slowed. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtler than that. A few heads turned, then a few more. Then whispers moved quietly from table to table like wind through tall grass. Last night's birthday scene had clearly traveled faster than I expected. At the center of the room stood Diane Parker. She wore a lavender designer suit and the expression of a woman hosting the most important day of her year. Her hair was perfectly styled, her diamonds carefully arranged, her smile bright and confident. Until she saw me. The smile faltered. Not much. Just enough. Ryan stood beside her, his posture stiff. He looked exhausted, as if he had spent the entire night trying to control a situation that refused to cooperate. Ashley Bennett stood several feet behind them. That surprised me. She wasn't seated beside Ryan like she had been the night before. Instead, she lingered near the edge of the crowd, speaking quietly with one of the foundation assistants. Her face was pale, and when our eyes met, she quickly looked away. Interesting. Diane recovered first. She walked toward me with the smooth, controlled grace she used whenever she believed she could still dominate a situation. Penelope, she said warmly, as if the previous evening had been nothing more than a mild misunderstanding. I'm glad you decided to come. I wouldn't miss it, I replied. Her smile tightened. Ryan stepped forward. Can we talk for a second? I glanced past him toward the stage where the event program was displayed on a tall easel. 11:10, welcome remarks. 11:20, tribute to Harold Parker. 11:35, scholarship announcement. Right on schedule. I think we'll all be talking soon, I said. Ryan lowered his voice. Penelope, please. Let's not do this here. Do what? You know what. I held his gaze. No, Ryan, I said calmly. I don't think you do. Diane's patience began to crack. Whatever argument you two are having, she said sharply, it will wait until after the presentation. This morning is about honoring Harold and celebrating our family's commitment to education. Our family. The phrase sounded almost theatrical now. Of course, I said lightly. Her eyes narrowed slightly. For a brief second, she looked at me the way a chess player studies an opponent, before realizing the board has already changed. Across the room, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune approached with a small camera crew. Mrs. Parker, he said to Diane, before the program begins, could you say a few words about the scholarship? Diane's smile returned instantly. Of course, she said, turning toward the camera with practiced ease. The Parker family has always believed that education is the foundation of opportunity. This scholarship represents our commitment to empowering women who— I walked past her toward the stage. The reporter paused. So the scholarship was your idea? He asked Diane. Absolutely, she said without hesitation. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. That was the moment I knew exactly how this would unfold. Because Diane truly believed the story she was telling. She believed the scholarship belonged to her. She believed the morning belonged to her. And most importantly, she believed I would remain silent. The event coordinator approached the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, she said brightly, if you could please take your seats, we will begin shortly. Guests moved toward their tables. The room slowly settled into anticipation. Ryan leaned closer to me one last time. Penelope, he whispered urgently. Whatever you're planning, don't do it. I turned to him. What makes you think this is about revenge? His expression hardened. Because you're angry. No, I said quietly. I'm finished. The lights dimmed slightly. The event coordinator returned to the microphone. Welcome everyone, to the Parker Family Foundation Legacy Brunch. Today we gather not only to celebrate Diane Parker's 67th birthday, but also to honor the extraordinary legacy of Harold Parker and announce a new scholarship initiative that will change lives. Polite applause filled the room. Diane stood gracefully as people clapped. Ryan clapped too. I remained seated. The coordinator continued. This scholarship, funded through the Parker family's generous philanthropic support, will provide educational opportunities for women returning to school after life disruptions. Please join me in welcoming the primary benefactor of this incredible program. She glanced at her notes. Mrs. Diane Parker. More applause. Diane stepped onto the stage. She adjusted the microphone and smiled warmly at the crowd. Thank you all for being here today, she began. My husband Harold believed deeply in second chances. He always said education was the greatest gift you could give someone rebuilding their life. She paused dramatically. And today, in his memory, our family is proud to introduce the Diane Parker Legacy Scholarship. Ryan applauded. Several guests nodded approvingly. Cameras flashed. Diane continued. This program will support women across Illinois who need the opportunity to return to school and build a better future. It represents everything Harold believed in. Actually, I said calmly from the front table. It doesn't. The room froze. Diane's voice stopped mid-sentence. 100 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Ryan whispered under his breath. Penelope. I stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor. I'm sorry to interrupt, I said politely, but the information you're presenting isn't correct. Diane stared at me in disbelief. What are you talking about? She snapped. I walked slowly toward the stage. The sound of my heels echoed across the marble floor. No one told you? I asked. Ryan's face drained of color. Penelope, he said quietly. Don't. I reached the stage and turned to the event coordinator. May I? She hesitated, then nodded. I stepped to the microphone. The room was completely silent now. Good morning, I said calmly. My name is Penelope Parker. I paused, letting the tension settle. And while Mrs. Parker has been speaking about a scholarship this morning, I glanced toward Diane. She forgot to mention one very important detail. Diane's voice trembled with fury. Penelope, this is not the time. It's exactly the time, I said. Then I looked out at the audience. The scholarship Diane just described, I continued, is funded entirely through my foundation. A ripple of surprise spread across the room. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. I continued calmly. And last night, after a rather revealing family event, I paused just long enough. I decided to make a small adjustment. Diane stepped toward me. You can't do that, she hissed. I smiled gently. Oh, I said. I already did. Then I turned back to the microphone. The program being announced today will no longer be called the Diane Parker Legacy Scholarship. Gasps echoed through the atrium. I folded my hands calmly. It will now be known as the Eleanor Brooks Grant for Women Rebuilding Their Lives. The room exploded with whispers. Diane's face went white. Ryan stared at the floor. Ashley looked stunned. I finished quietly. Because dignity, I said, should never depend on people who refuse to respect it. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. And in that moment, every person in the room realized something Diane Parker had never expected. The woman she tried to humiliate the night before, was the one who controlled the entire story. For a few seconds after I finished speaking, the room was completely silent. Not polite silence, not confused silence. The kind of silence that happens when an entire room realizes the story they were told is suddenly wrong. Diane Parker stood beside me on the stage, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and fury. The confidence she had walked in with that morning was gone. "Penelope," she said sharply into the microphone, "you're making a mistake." Her voice carried through the speakers, but the power behind it had already cracked. I tilted my head slightly. "A mistake?" I repeated calmly. "Yes," she snapped. "This scholarship was organized under the Parker Family Foundation. You cannot just walk in here and change everything." I let her words hang in the air for a moment. Then I answered the way a person does when they already know the outcome. "Actually," I said, "I can." A ripple moved through the audience. At the front table, two members of the museum board exchanged uneasy glances. The university representative flipped quickly through the printed program in front of him. Ryan finally stepped forward. "Penelope," he said under his breath, trying to keep his voice low enough that the microphones wouldn't pick it up. "Stop this right now." I turned toward him. "Stop what? You're humiliating my mother." That sentence was almost impressive in its lack of awareness. I raised an eyebrow. "Ryan," I said quietly, "last night your mother seated your lover in my place at her birthday dinner." His jaw tightened. "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" He didn't answer. Behind him, Ashley Bennett had gone completely pale. She looked as if she had suddenly realized she was standing in the middle of a story she didn't fully understand. Diane stepped closer to the microphone again. "This is a private family disagreement," she said quickly to the crowd, forcing a brittle smile. "I'm sure Penelope is simply upset about last night's misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. The word floated through the room like something fragile and ridiculous. I turned to the audience. "I'm afraid it isn't a misunderstanding," I said calmly. Ryan inhaled sharply. "Penelope." But it was too late. "The scholarship fund Diane just mentioned," I continued, "is financed through the Brooks Educational Foundation, which belongs to my family. My team prepared the endowment structure, the grant program, and the university partnership." Murmurs spread quickly now. The reporter from the Chicago Tribune leaned forward in his seat, clearly sensing a story unfolding. One of the museum trustees spoke quietly to another board member. Diane's voice sharpened. "That is completely irrelevant," she said. "The Parker Foundation is the public sponsor of this event." I nodded politely. "Yes," I said. "It was." Then I gestured toward the large presentation screen behind the stage. "Would you mind showing the final slide from the presentation file?" The event coordinator hesitated, looking nervously between Diane and me. Ryan stepped forward again. "This presentation was approved yesterday," he said quickly. "That's true," I replied. Then I added calmly, "And I revised it this morning." The coordinator glanced toward Diane. Diane glared back. "Don't you dare." But the slide appeared on the screen anyway. A dark navy background, white text in simple, elegant letters. "The Eleanor Brooks Grant for Women Rebuilding Their Lives." Gasps rippled across the room. Ryan turned slowly toward the screen. "What did you do?" he whispered. I faced the audience again. "This grant will support women returning to school after leaving financially or emotionally unstable relationships," I said. "Tuition assistance, career training, and legal resources will be included." The reporter raised his hand immediately. "Mrs. Parker," he asked, "are you saying the Parker Foundation is no longer involved in this program?" I smiled slightly. "The Parker Foundation," I said carefully, "will not be representing this scholarship." That sentence landed harder than anything else I had said so far. Because now the donors understood the implication. This wasn't just a family argument. It was a philanthropic correction. Diane's composure finally cracked. "You ungrateful girl," she hissed, forgetting the microphones were still live. "After everything this family has given you." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. I looked at her quietly. "Given me?" I repeated. Ryan stepped forward again, desperation now clear in his voice. "Penelope, we can fix this. Just walk off the stage and we'll talk privately." I shook my head slowly. That opportunity ended last night. Ashley suddenly spoke for the first time. "Ryan," she whispered, "you told me the scholarship was your family's project." Her voice carried farther than she expected. Several guests turned toward her immediately. Ryan looked stunned. "Ashley, this isn't the time." She stared at him, confusion replacing embarrassment. You said Penelope was just helping with funding, she said. Diane snapped toward her. Be quiet. Ashley blinked. The realization spreading across her face was almost painful to watch. You told me the foundation belonged to you, she said softly to Ryan. Ryan said nothing. The silence was answer enough. I turned back to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I said calmly, I apologize for the unexpected change in this morning's program. I paused briefly. But sometimes clarity arrives when we finally stop pretending things are different from what they are. The museum chairwoman stood slowly. Mrs. Parker, she said carefully, does this mean the Brooks Foundation will now administer the grant independently? Yes, I said. And the Parker Foundation? I glanced toward Diane and Ryan. They are no longer involved. That was the moment the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. Not dramatic, not explosive, just final. The donors began whispering to each other. The reporter started typing notes quickly. The museum trustees exchanged concerned looks, because people in those circles understood one thing very well. Philanthropy runs on reputation, and reputations can collapse quietly in rooms exactly like this. Diane looked at Ryan in disbelief. Do something, she demanded under her breath. Ryan stared helplessly between us. What do you want from me? He whispered. I met his eyes. Nothing. That answer hit him harder than anger ever could. Because for the first time since we met, Ryan Parker realized something he had never imagined. He no longer had any influence over what happened next. I stepped away from the microphone. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then stronger. Not for drama, not for scandal, but for something simpler, truth. And as I walked off the stage, I realized something surprising. For the first time since entering that ballroom the night before, I felt completely calm, because the worst part of the story had already happened. And now the rest of my life could finally begin. The applause faded slowly as I stepped off the stage. It wasn't thunderous, it wasn't dramatic, but it was sincere. And that alone was enough to change the balance of the room. People who had arrived expecting a polite charity announcement were now witnessing something far more uncomfortable, a public shift of power. I walked back toward the front table where my coat was resting. Behind me, Diane's voice rose sharply. This event is not over. The words cut through the room. Several guests froze mid-step. Diane stood rigid near the microphone, her polished composure completely gone now. The careful social mask she had worn for decades had cracked wide open. You cannot hijack my event like this, she snapped toward me. I turned slowly. Your event? I asked calmly. Yes, she said. This celebration is for my birthday and my family's foundation. A few donors exchanged glances. That phrasing mattered. Because now the room understood something Diane clearly hadn't realized yet. The moment the funding changed, the event's center of gravity changed too. The museum chairwoman approached cautiously. Mrs. Parker, she said diplomatically, perhaps we should move forward with the remainder of the program. Diane spun toward her. Of course we will, she said sharply. This morning is about the Parker family legacy. Ryan finally stepped forward. Mom, he said quietly, maybe we should just end it. Diane turned on him immediately. End it? She repeated. You're just going to let her walk in here and take everything? Ryan rubbed his temples. This isn't helping. Ashley was still standing near the edge of the room, her arms folded tightly as if she wished she could disappear into the marble floor. The reporter from the Tribune raised his hand again. Mrs. Parker, he asked Diane, is the Parker Foundation losing its partnership with the Brooks Foundation? Diane's answer came instantly. Absolutely not. Every head in the room turned toward me. I didn't speak. Jordan Matthews did. He had arrived quietly during the last few minutes and now stepped forward beside the museum board members. I'm afraid that statement is incorrect, he said calmly. Diane stared at him. And you are? Jordan Matthews, he replied. Legal counsel for the Brooks Foundation. A murmur moved through the room. Ryan's shoulders stiffened. Jordan continued smoothly. As of 8:30 this morning, formal notice was delivered to the Parker Family Foundation, confirming that all funding previously allocated to the scholarship program has been reassigned under independent administration. He placed a thin folder on the table in front of the museum chairwoman. Documentation has also been provided to the museum board and the university partners. The chairwoman opened the folder and skimmed the first page. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Diane looked from the folder to Ryan. You knew about this? Ryan looked exhausted. No. For the first time that morning, Diane seemed genuinely rattled. She turned toward me. You planned this, she said. I met her gaze. No, I said quietly. You planned last night. The room was so still now that the soft piano music from the far corner sounded almost absurd. Diane's voice dropped. You're destroying this family. The sentence might have sounded powerful if it hadn't come after everything the room had already witnessed. I answered simply. No, Diane. I'm leaving it. Ryan finally lost his composure. Penelope, this is insane, he said. You can't just cut us out of everything. Why not? I asked. Because we're your family. That word again. Family. I studied him for a moment. You mean the family that let my seat be taken by your girlfriend? Ashley flinched. Ryan glanced back at her, then quickly away. That's not what she is, he muttered. The reporter raised an eyebrow. Ashley's voice came quietly from behind him. Ryan, she said, you told me your marriage was already over. The room shifted again. Ryan's face went pale. That's not what I meant. Ashley looked stunned. You said you and Penelope barely spoke anymore, she continued. You said she only cared about work and didn't care what you did. Diane snapped. This is not the place for this conversation. Ashley laughed softly. It wasn't cruel. It was the sound of someone realizing they had been lied to. You invited me here, she said to Diane. You sat me next to him. Diane glared. Because you were useful. The bluntness of the comment shocked even Ryan. Ashley stared at her. Useful? Yes, Diane said coldly. You made Ryan happy. And frankly, that was more than Penelope managed. Ryan whispered. Mom. But the damage was done. Several guests looked openly uncomfortable now. The museum chairwoman cleared her throat. I think, she said carefully, it would be best to conclude the formal program here. No one objected. The donors began quietly collecting their things. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Phones appeared as several journalists stepped outside to make calls. Because everyone in that room understood something important. This was no longer just a family argument. It was a reputational collapse. Ryan turned toward me one last time. Penelope, he said quietly, you didn't have to do it like this. I tilted my head slightly. Like what? In public. I considered that. Then I answered honestly. Ryan, you humiliated me in public. He shook his head. That was different. I waited. But he couldn't explain how. Because deep down, he knew the truth. It had never been different. It had just been convenient. I picked up my coat from the table. The museum staff were already beginning to clear the unused breakfast plates. The entire room felt strangely lighter, as if a storm had passed and left behind only quiet air. As I walked toward the exit, Ryan called after me. What happens now? I paused near the doorway. Then I looked back at him. Now? I said calmly. Now you live with the choices you made. Then I stepped outside into the bright Chicago afternoon. The lake wind was cool against my face. Behind me, the Parker family legacy event was ending in confusion and whispers. Ahead of me, the rest of my life was waiting. And for the first time in years, it felt completely open. The first thing I felt when I stepped outside the museum wasn't triumph. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after months of tension finally releases. The air off Lake Michigan was cool, carrying the faint scent of water and early autumn leaves. Chicago traffic hummed in the distance, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded inside the museum. For a moment, I simply stood there on the steps, breathing, letting the silence settle. Then my phone vibrated. Jordan, I answered. Well, he said calmly, that was effective. I laughed softly. That's one word for it. You handled it perfectly, he continued. Clear, factual, and legally clean. No accusations, no drama, just the truth. Diane didn't think so. Jordan chuckled. Diane isn't the audience that matters right now. He was right. Because the real audience had already started reacting. By the time I reached my car, my phone was lighting up with notifications. Emails from board members. Messages from the university. 2 requests for interviews from local reporters. One subject line stood out among them. Tribune inquiry. Clarification regarding Parker Foundation event. The story was already spreading. Not in the explosive, scandal-driven way social media loves, but in the quieter, more serious way reputational shifts move through professional circles. I placed the phone on the passenger seat without responding. For the first time since the night before, I allowed myself to think about what came next. Divorce, asset separation, legal proceedings. But oddly enough, none of that scared me anymore. Because the hardest part had already happened. The moment when you finally stop pretending the relationship can still be saved. My phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from someone unexpected. Ashley Bennett. I hesitated before opening it. The message was short. Penelope, I didn't know the truth about the foundation. Ryan told me the scholarship was his family's project. I realize now that I should have asked more questions. I'm sorry for my role in everything. I read the message twice. There was no excuse in it. No attempt to shift blame. Just a simple apology. I typed a response slowly. Thank you for saying that. I paused. Then added one more line. Take care of yourself. After sending the message, I set the phone down again. Some things didn't need to become battles. As I started the car, another notification appeared. This one from Ryan. Not a call. An email. Subject line. We need to talk. I almost ignored it. But curiosity won. The email contained only 2 sentences. Penelope, please don't file anything yet. We can still resolve this privately. Just tell me what you want. I stared at the screen for a long moment. For years, Ryan had assumed the answer to that question was simple. Respect. Partnership. Honesty. None of those things had seemed unreasonable at the time. But now, the question itself felt irrelevant. Because the moment I walked out of that ballroom, what I wanted had changed. I closed the email without replying. Then I drove away from the museum. Over the next few weeks, the consequences unfolded quietly. Ryan's firm placed him on administrative leave pending an internal review of several financial reimbursements connected to the foundation events. The Parker Family Foundation announced a temporary pause on new philanthropic initiatives. 2 donors withdrew their pledges until governance issues were clarified. None of it involved shouting. None of it involved revenge. Just accountability. Jordan handled most of the legal work. The separation paperwork was filed within a week. Ryan's attorney requested mediation. I agreed. Not because I hoped to repair anything, but because clarity is easier to achieve when everything is documented. The mediation meeting took place in a neutral conference room downtown. Ryan looked exhausted when he walked in. His suit was wrinkled. His tie was loose. The confidence he used to carry like armor had disappeared. Penelope, he said quietly. I nodded. We sat across from each other. The mediator began outlining the process. Ryan barely listened. Instead, he looked directly at me. I didn't think you'd actually leave, he admitted. I considered the statement. That's the problem, I said. What do you mean? You never believed there would be consequences. He ran a hand through his hair. I made mistakes. Yes, I said calmly. But the mistake wasn't Ashley. He frowned. It wasn't? No, I said. The mistake was believing you could treat me like an option. Ryan stared at the table. For the first time since I met him, he didn't have an answer. The mediation session lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the outcome was straightforward. Asset division, property separation, formal dissolution of the marriage. No dramatic arguments. No emotional breakdowns. Just signatures. When we stood to leave, Ryan spoke one last time. Penelope, he said quietly. Do you ever think things could have been different? I thought about that question longer than he probably expected. Then I answered honestly. Yes. His eyes lifted slightly. But only if you had respected me before you lost me. He nodded slowly. And for the first time, I believed he understood. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. Winter arrived in Chicago with cold wind and clear skies. By then, the Eleanor Brooks Grant for Women Rebuilding Their Lives had officially launched. Applications began arriving almost immediately. Single mothers returning to college. Women rebuilding careers after controlling relationships. Professionals restarting their education after financial setbacks. The stories were powerful, humbling, and strangely healing. One afternoon, as I reviewed the first round of applications, Jordan stopped by my office. You look different, he said. How? Lighter. I smiled. Freedom has that effect. He nodded thoughtfully. You know, he said, most people would have used that moment for revenge. Maybe, I said, but revenge doesn't build anything. I looked out the window toward the city skyline. This does. And for the first time in a very long time, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt earned. Almost a year later, I returned to the Lakeshore Women's Museum. The building looked exactly the same. Same glass entrance. Same quiet lake behind it. Same polished marble floors inside the atrium. But the atmosphere felt different. Not because the building had changed. Because I had. This time the banner near the entrance read, "The Eleanor Brooks Grant First Annual Scholarship Ceremony." I paused for a moment before walking inside. A year ago, I had stood in that same place carrying the weight of a marriage that was already breaking. I had been trying to hold together a relationship, a family reputation, and a version of myself that kept shrinking just to keep the peace. Today, none of that weight remained. Inside the museum, the room was filled with a different kind of energy. Not the polished social networking of wealthy donors. Something warmer, more genuine. 30 women sat at round tables across the atrium. Some were in their 20s, others in their 40s or 50s. Each one had a story about starting over. One had left a financially controlling partner and was returning to law school. Another was a nurse finishing the degree she abandoned after her divorce. A third had spent 10 years raising children before deciding she wanted a career of her own. Their conversations filled the room with laughter and cautious excitement. Real hope. The museum chairwoman approached me with a smile. "Penelope," she said warmly, "it's good to see you again." "Thank you for hosting us again," I replied. She glanced around the room. "This program has already helped more women in a year than we expected in 3. I followed her gaze. "That's the goal." Jordan Matthews arrived a few minutes later carrying a stack of folders. "Your speakers are ready," he said. "Good." He handed me a small card. "Your remarks." I looked down at the card. Just a few sentences. Nothing dramatic. Jordan watched me for a moment before speaking. "You know," he said, "last year when this all started, I assumed the scholarship would eventually become another foundation project." "What do you mean?" "Corporate sponsors. Fundraising dinners. The usual philanthropic machine." I smiled slightly. "That wasn't the point." "No," he admitted. "It wasn't." The event coordinator stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "welcome to the first annual Eleanor Brooks Grant Ceremony. Today we celebrate 30 women who chose courage over comfort and decided to rebuild their futures." Applause filled the room. I walked toward the stage. Not with nerves. Not with anger. Just with clarity. The microphone waited where it had stood the year before. The same place where everything changed. I looked out across the audience. 30 women sat in front of me. 30-second chances. "Good afternoon," I began. "My name is Penelope Brooks." A few of the women smiled at the name change. "I started this program because I learned something important about dignity." The room grew quiet. A year ago, I found myself standing in a room where someone else believed they had the power to define my value. I paused. Not with violence. Not with threats. Just with disrespect. Several women nodded softly. "And for a long time," I continued, "I believed the way to survive that kind of treatment was patience." I folded my hands lightly. "But patience is not the same thing as self-respect." The words settled across the room. Sometimes the strongest decision you can make is not to fight someone. Sometimes it's simply to leave. The audience remained completely still. When you walk away from people who refuse to respect you, something interesting happens. I smiled. You don't lose your life. You get it back. Applause spread slowly across the room. Not loud, but deeply felt. After the ceremony ended, the scholarship recipients gathered for photos near the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. One of the women approached me quietly. She looked to be in her early 40s. "Miss Brooks," she said nervously, "I just wanted to thank you." "You're very welcome," I said. She hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. How did you know it was time to leave your situation?" I thought about that question carefully. Because the truth wasn't simple. "It wasn't one moment," I said. "It was a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" "The kind where someone keeps showing you exactly how little they value you." She nodded slowly. "And when you see that pattern clearly," I continued, "the decision stops being frightening. What does it become? Obvious." She smiled softly. "That's how it felt when I applied for this grant." I returned the smile. "Then you already understand the lesson." As the event ended and the room slowly emptied, I stood by the window looking out at the lake. A year earlier, that same view had marked the end of one life. Today it marked the beginning of many others. Jordan walked up beside me. "You know," he said, Ryan tried to contact me again last month. I glanced at him. What did he want? He asked if you would ever consider speaking with him. I looked back out at the water. What did you tell him? That it wasn't my decision. I thought about the question for a moment. Then I shook my head gently. Some chapters don't need revisiting. Jordan nodded. That's what I figured. Outside, the lake wind moved across the water in long silver lines. I watched the waves for a moment before turning away from the window. Because the truth is, the most powerful ending to a story isn't revenge. It's growth. And sometimes the best way to move forward is simply to keep walking. Lesson from the story. This story reminds us of a powerful truth. Respect is not something you beg for. It is something you require. When someone repeatedly shows you who you are to them, believe them. Walking away from disrespect is not failure, it is self-respect. The end of a painful chapter can become the beginning of a meaningful purpose. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not hurting the people who hurt you. It's building a life so strong that their approval is no longer necessary.